The air inside the buried Pullman car was colder than a tomb, yet the silence was a mercy, a sudden absolute stillness after the screaming wind. 12-year-old Elijah Samuel Crawford didn't feel the chill seeping through his threadbare coat. His fingers, numb and clumsy, traced the faded cursive on a yellowed piece of paper he'd found inside a heavy wooden trunk. He held his 11-month-old brother, Noah, tighter against his chest, the small warm weight a fragile anchor in the disorienting dark. He had just forced open the frozen door of this forgotten railcar, a metal shell entombed in the Wyoming hills, and discovered a sanctuary from the blizzard that was meant to be his grave. But relief was a distant, alien emotion. Instead, as he read the words meant for a beloved daughter he would never know, a girl named Clara promised magical adventures on her 10th birthday. A profound and hollow grief cracked open inside him. He wept, not for his own frozen limbs or the gnawing hunger, but for a love so vast and unconditional it felt like a ghost from another world. This is a story about the strength that can be found in the most desolate of places, and the echoes of love that can save a life long after they were first spoken. If you feel the weight of this moment, let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Your support helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. So please consider liking this narrative and subscribing to our channel. The journey of how this boy and a forgotten letter saved an entire town is one you will not want to miss, and we are grateful to have you with us for it. But to understand why a 12-year-old boy was weeping in a buried train car, instead of celebrating his survival, we must go back 4 hours. We must return to the biting cold outside the walls of the St. Joseph's Orphanage, to the moment Director Horace Blackwood's face, contorted with rage, appeared in the doorway. It was there, with the full force of a February blizzard raging behind him, that Blackwood declared he would not waste another meal on a thief, and with a final, brutal shove, he cast Elijah and the feverish infant in his arms out into the unforgiving night, locking the heavy oak door behind them and sealing their fate in the heart of the storm. For 3 years, life for Elijah Samuel Crawford had been measured in degrees of cold. Ever since the day the ground had swallowed the Black Creek mine, taking his father and mother with it, warmth had become a distant, almost mythical concept. At 12 years old, his world had shrunk to the frigid, damp-smelling dormitories of the St. Joseph's Orphanage, a place whose name was a bitter irony whispered among the 40 boys who called it home. His existence was a cycle of shivering dawns and frost-laced window panes, a life lived under the perpetual grey sky of the Wyoming winter. He had learned to read the moods of the wind better than the faces of the other children, because the wind was a more honest indicator of the suffering to come. The past was a ghost, a collection of fading memories of a small, warm house filled with the scent of baking bread and the low, rumbling laughter of his father. A life so completely gone it felt like it had belonged to someone else. Each morning began not with light, but with the violent clang of a handbell that echoed off the stone walls, a sound that seemed to crack the very air. Sleep was never a refuge, merely a temporary cessation of shivering beneath a single threadbare wool blanket that did little to fend off the cold seeping up from the floorboards. The first conscious thought of every day was hunger, a dull, persistent ache deep in his belly that was never truly satisfied. It was a constant companion, a reminder of his own powerlessness. The boys would shuffle from their cots, their movements slow and heavy, their breath pluming in the unheated air as they dressed in patched clothes that were always slightly damp. There was no joy in the morning, no anticipation for the day ahead, only the grim resignation of enduring another cycle of cold and want, a quiet, shared misery that bound them together more than any brotherhood ever could. His true purpose, the single burning star in his desolate sky, was Noah. At 11 months old, his little brother was a fragile flame that Elijah had to cup his hands around constantly, shielding him from the drafts and the neglect that defined their world. He had become an expert in the silent language of infancy, able to distinguish a cry of hunger from one of pain or cold. He learned to change Noah's swaddling in the dark, his fingers deft and gentle, and how to rock him to sleep against his own bony chest, humming a tune his mother used to sing until his own throat ached, with the effort of remembering it. Noah was not a burden. He was an anchor. He was the only piece of his old life that was still warm, still breathing, a living testament to the family he had lost, and the reason he forced himself to wake up to the sound of that terrible bell each day. The architect of their suffering was director Horace Blackwood, a man of 55, whose presence was a physical weight in any room he entered. He was tall and gaunt, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from ice, and eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He rarely raised his voice, for he didn't need to. His power was in his quiet, deliberate cruelty, the way he would let his gaze linger on a boy who had coughed too loudly, or the thin, cruel smile that would touch his lips when he announced the day's rations would be even smaller than usual. The sound of his polished boots on the stone floors was enough to silence any conversation, to make every boy freeze in place. He was the embodiment of the cold, a man whose heart seemed to have frozen solid long ago, leaving only a chilling void where compassion should have been. The orphanage was a carefully constructed lie. To the town of Millbrook, it was St. Joseph's, a sanctuary for the unfortunate, funded by meager church donations and the supposed generosity of its director. But within its walls, the truth was stark and unforgiving. The food was a watery, tasteless gruel, occasionally thickened with potato peelings. The fires in the main hall were kept just high enough to prevent the pipes from freezing, but never enough to offer real warmth. Sickness was a constant resident, a dry, hacking cough that passed from one boy to the next in an endless, miserable chain. The children knew, with the certainty of the oppressed, that Director Blackwood's private quarters were always warm, that his meals were substantial, and that the charity he preached was a performance for the outside world, a mask to hide the deep, rotting corruption within. Elijah's most precious possessions were not things he could hold, but memories he fought to keep from fading. He would lie awake in the dark, long after the other boys had fallen into a restless sleep, and try to conjure his father's face. He would focus on the details, the coal dust permanently etched into the lines of his hands, the smell of machine oil and tobacco that clung to his clothes, the patient way he would explain the mechanics of a steam engine. His father had been a machinist before the mines, a man who understood pressure and force, who saw the world as a series of interconnected parts that could be understood and repaired. These fragments of knowledge were all Elijah had left of him, and he hoarded them like jewels, turning them over and over in his mind, feeling the ghost of his father's steady presence in the logic of gears and levers. A deeper, more immediate fear than hunger or cold haunted the older boys. It was the fear of disappearing. 3 times in the last year, boys who had grown strong enough to work had been taken from their beds in the dead of night, their meager belongings gone by morning. The official story was that they had been sent to apprentice with good families in the East, but the whispers told a different tale. They were sold for a handful of dollars as cheap labor to the railroad gangs pushing the Union Pacific line further west. It was a fate worse than the orphanage, a sentence of brutal, back-breaking labor from which no one ever returned. Elijah saw the way Blackwood looked at the stronger boys, his eyes calculating their worth not as children, but as livestock to be sold at market. He knew his own time was coming, and the thought filled him with a cold dread. In this landscape of despair, love was an act of rebellion. Elijah's devotion to Noah was his silent defiance against Blackwood's dehumanizing regime. He would steal scraps of fabric from the mending room to create an extra layer of lining for Noah's swaddling. He would save a portion of his own meager ration, chewing the stale bread into a soft paste that the baby could swallow, feeling the sharp pangs in his own stomach as a small, worthy sacrifice. At night, he would shield Noah's small body with his own, taking the brunt of the cold that radiated from the stone wall. These were not grand gestures, but they were everything. They were a declaration that, in a place designed to crush the human spirit, he would not let his own or his brother's be extinguished. He was keeping a promise to his parents, a promise made to their memory that he would protect what was left of their family. There were no true friendships in St. Joseph's, only shifting, fragile alliances born of mutual desperation. The older boys, hardened by years of Blackwood's rule, often mimicked his cruelty, preying on the younger and weaker ones to gain a sliver of power or an extra crust of bread. Elijah remained apart from these brutal hierarchies, his focus singular and absolute. His isolation made him a target, but his fierce, almost feral protection of Noah earned him a grudging, wary respect. The other boys saw in him a purpose that they themselves had lost, a reason to fight that went beyond their own survival. They left him alone, watching him from a distance as he cared for the infant with a tenderness that seemed alien in that harsh, unforgiving place. He and Noah were an island of two in a sea of misery. To Director Blackwood, Noah was the ultimate symbol of waste. An infant could not work, could not be sold, and could not contribute to the orphanage's meager productivity. He was, in Blackwood's cold calculus, a net loss. The director never missed an opportunity to remind Elijah of this, his words dripping with contempt. He referred to Noah as the burden or that useless mouth, his comments always loud enough for Elijah and the other boys to hear. Each time, Elijah would feel a surge of hot, protective anger, but he learned to swallow it, to lower his eyes and say nothing. He knew that any sign of defiance would only bring greater cruelty down upon them both. He understood that in Blackwood's eyes, Noah's life was not just valueless. It was a liability, one the director would be all too willing to eliminate. The weight of this responsibility had aged Elijah far beyond his 12 years. The carefree energy of childhood was a foreign country he could barely remember visiting. His thoughts were not of games or play, but of strategy and survival. He was constantly calculating, assessing risks, and planning for a future that seemed to shrink with each passing day. He knew how to listen to the floorboards to track Blackwood's movements, how to hide a piece of bread so the rats wouldn't find it, and how to interpret the subtle changes in Noah's breathing. He was a general in a war no one else could see, fighting a desperate, lonely campaign for two. This constant vigilance had carved lines of worry onto his young face and put a permanent tension in his shoulders, the physical manifestation of a burden no child should ever have to carry. The world of St. Joseph's was a symphony of sorrowful sounds. It was the hollow clatter of tin bowls on the long, splintered wooden tables in the dining hall. It was the relentless, whistling cry of the wind as it found its way through every crack and crevice in the building's old stone walls. It was the chorus of wet, rasping coughs that filled the dormitory each night, a constant reminder of the sickness that thrived in the cold, damp air. And over it all there was the silence, the profound, heavy silence of children who had learned that speaking out only brought pain. That hope was a dangerous extravagance. The air itself felt heavy with unspoken grief, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, lye soap, and the faint, ever-present odor of decay. This relentless present was built on the foundation of a trauma that never healed. The memory of the mine collapse was not a single sharp event, but a lingering poison. Elijah remembered the sudden, unnatural stillness that fell over the town, the way the cheerful noise of the afternoon had simply stopped. He remembered the shift whistle that never blew. He remembered the faces of the women gathered at the mine entrance, their hope slowly curdling into a raw, keening despair that echoed through the hills for days. He had lost not just his parents, but the very concept of safety, the belief that the world was a stable and predictable place. His fierce protection of Noah was a desperate attempt to rebuild that foundation, to create a single point of certainty in a world that had proven to be treacherous and unforgiving. The blizzard that would seal their fate did not arrive unannounced. It had been a threat on the horizon for days, a darkening of the skies that promised a new level of cold. On that Tuesday in late February, the wind began to howl with a new and terrifying ferocity, and the temperature plummeted. Inside the orphanage, the cold was more biting than ever, a physical presence that seemed to suck the very breath from their lungs. And it was on this day that Noah's quiet sniffles had turned into a full-blown fever. By evening, his small body was radiating a frightening heat, and he refused the watery gruel, his weak cries cutting through Elijah with a pain sharper than his own hunger. Desperation, cold and sharp, began to coil in Elijah's stomach. He knew he had to do something, anything, to get some real food into his brother. The risk no longer mattered, only Noah's survival did. The desperate plan took root in the space between his brother's shallow, rattling breaths. Elijah lay in the darkness, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from Noah's tiny body, a fever that was consuming him from the inside out. The watery gruel served hours earlier had been refused. Dribbling from the corner of the baby's mouth, offering no sustenance. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful in its clarity. His mother, her hands dusted with flour, mashing a piece of warm bread with milk in a small bowl for him when he was sick with a winter chill. The thought was a torment, a vision of a love and care so distant it felt like a dream, but it was also a spark. The kitchen, with its locked pantry and the constant threat of Director Blackwood's presence, was the most dangerous territory in St. Joseph's. Yet, as Noah let out a weak, whimpering cry that was barely audible above the howling wind, Elijah knew that the risk of staying put had become infinitely greater than the risk of acting. The fear of being caught was a distant, cold star compared to the burning, immediate terror of watching his brother fade away. He moved with a silence born of 3 years of practice, a ghost slipping from his cot. The stone floor was a sheet of ice against the soles of his bare feet, the cold shooting up his legs in sharp, painful jolts. Every sound in the dormitory was magnified in the tense quiet. The rustle of a thin blanket, the soft moan of a boy lost in a troubled dream, the incessant rhythmic coughing from the far side of the room. But the dominant sound was the wind, a relentless, screaming entity that clawed at the window panes and rattled the very foundations of the building. It was a monster outside the walls, but the true monster he knew slept in the warm quarters at the end of the hall. He navigated the maze of cots, his breath held tight in his chest, his senses on fire. The air grew colder as he neared the kitchen corridor, carrying the faint, sour smell of boiled potatoes and lye soap, the permanent scent of their institutional hunger. He reached the heavy wooden door, his small hand hesitating for a fraction of a second on the cold iron latch before he pushed it open and slipped inside. The kitchen was a cavern of deeper shadows and unfamiliar smells. Here, the air was thick with the ghostly aromas of meals he could only imagine, roasted meat, baking spices, and the rich, yeasty scent of real bread. It was the director's private larder, a fortress of plenty in their world of perpetual want. His eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, making out the hulking shape of the cast-iron stove and the long wooden prep table. His target was the pantry, a small room at the back where the real food was kept under lock and key. But on the counter next to a cutting board sat the bread box. Hope, sharp and dangerous, surged through him. His heart hammered against his ribs as he lifted the lid. Inside lay half a loaf of day-old bread. It was dense and hard, nothing like the soft bread of his memory, but it was more precious than gold. He seized it, his fingers trembling, the rough crust scratching his skin as he clutched it to his chest like a holy relic. As he turned, a sound cut through the darkness, a sharp, percussive scrape of a matchstick against a boot. A tiny flame erupted, a single point of yellow light that seemed to suck all the air from the room. In its flickering, malevolent glow, a face emerged from the shadows in the corner. Director Horace Blackwood was sitting in a high-backed chair, a dark, motionless figure who had been there all along, watching, waiting. The bread in Elijah's hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a stone of guilt that would drag him to the bottom of the sea. Time seemed to stop. The only sounds were the furious beating of Elijah's own heart and the low, hungry hiss of the match as it burned down toward the director's fingers. There was no surprise on Blackwood's face, only a cold, reptilian satisfaction, the look of a predator whose trap had finally been sprung. Elijah stood frozen, caught in the amber glow of that tiny, merciless flame, unable to run, unable to breathe. The director rose from his chair without a word, his tall, gaunt frame unfolding from the darkness like a spectre. He let the match burn out, plunging the room back into near-total blackness, a deliberate act of psychological warfare that left Elijah blind and terrified. He could hear the director's slow, measured footsteps approaching on the stone floor, the soft, confident sound of his polished boots, a stark contrast to the frantic, silent terror gripping the boy. When Blackwood was only a few feet away, his voice sliced through the silence, not with a shout, but with a low, chilling whisper that was far more menacing. He didn't ask what Elijah was doing, he didn't need to. Instead, he simply stated a fact, his tone dripping with a cold, triumphant venom. He said that he had always known Elijah was a defiant, ungrateful creature, and that tonight he had finally been given the proof he needed to act upon that knowledge. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the promise of a violence that was all the more terrifying for being so quietly promised. Elijah's voice, when he finally found it, was a reedy, desperate tremor in the oppressive darkness. The words spilled out of him in a frantic, jumbled plea, a last-ditch effort to appeal to a humanity he wasn't sure the director even possessed. He tried to explain that the bread wasn't for him, that it was for Noah. He described the fever, the weak, shallow breaths, the way the baby refused the tasteless gruel that was little more than wallpaper paste. He spoke of his mother, of the soft bread mash that could soothe a sick child, his explanation becoming a raw, unfiltered confession of his love and his fear. He held the half-loaf out in the darkness, not as stolen goods, but as medicine, as a desperate prescription for his dying brother. It was a plea for mercy, an appeal from one human being to another, a gamble on the faint, flickering hope that a shred of compassion might exist within the director's frozen heart. Blackwood's response was a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor, like stones grinding together. He completely ignored the boy's desperate explanation, treating it as nothing more than the pathetic whining of a cornered animal. In his cold, cruel calculus, Noah's sickness was not a tragedy, but an inconvenience, and Elijah's love was not a virtue, but a weakness to be exploited. He accused Elijah of a deeper crime than theft. He called it a crime of sentiment, of wasting precious emotional and physical resources on a defective unit, a useless mouth that contributed nothing to the orphanage's bleak economy. He twisted the boy's desperate protective love into a selfish, rebellious act. He proclaimed that St. Joseph's was not a hospital for the weak, but a crucible for the strong, and that Elijah, by clinging to his dying brother, had proven himself unfit, a drain on a system that had no room for charity or compassion. With a sudden, violent movement, Blackwood's hand shot out and clamped down on Elijah's upper arm. The director's fingers were like bands of cold iron, digging into the boy's thin muscle and bone with a strength that made him cry out in pain. He was dragged from the kitchen, his bare feet stumbling and sliding on the cold stone floor as he struggled to keep up. The precious half-loaf of bread was knocked from his grasp, falling to the floor with a hollow thud before being kicked aside by the director's boot. They moved through the great hall, a blur of motion and fear, the director's silent, focused rage pulling Elijah along like a rag doll. The wind outside seemed to sense the shift, its howling growing louder and more frantic, a wild symphony for the unfolding cruelty. Blackwood wasn't just angry, he was energized, his eyes gleaming with a righteous fury as he hauled the boy toward the massive oak door that served as the final barrier between their cold, miserable world and the lethal chaos of the blizzard outside. He wrenched the heavy door open, and the storm lunged into the hall. It was a solid wall of wind and ice, a deafening roar that filled the space with a blinding, swirling whiteness. The sudden extreme cold was a physical blow, stealing the air from Elijah's lungs and instantly numbing his exposed skin. Blackwood shoved him forward, forcing him onto the threshold where the full, unrestrained fury of the blizzard hit him. Over the shriek of the wind, the director's voice rose, not in a shout, but in a clear, deliberate proclamation, meant to be heard by any boy who might be awake. He declared that he would no longer tolerate the burden of a thief. He announced that the orphanage's meager resources would not be wasted on the ungrateful, and that from this moment on Elijah Samuel Crawford and the useless infant he so foolishly protected were no longer his concern. The words were a formal decree of banishment, a legalistic and cruel severing of the last thin thread that tied them to the world of the living. This was not a mere punishment. It was a carefully pronounced sentence of death. Blackwood leaned in close, his face inches from Elijah's, his breath a foul cloud in the freezing air. He explained, with a chilling, almost academic precision, that this was the perfect solution. The storm was an act of God, a natural and efficient force that would cleanse the orphanage of its weakest elements. By morning, he said with a thin, cruel smile, the problem of 2 extra mouths to feed would be gone, erased by the snow. There would be no bodies to bury, no questions to answer. The blizzard would be their executioner, their tomb, and their alibi, all in one. He wanted Elijah to understand the finality of it, to know that this was not a moment of anger that would pass, but a calculated, irreversible decision. He was being cast out, not just from the orphanage, but from existence itself. Before Elijah could even process the full horror of his sentence, Blackwood released him and strode back into the dormitory, his boots echoing with grim purpose. A moment later he returned, carrying the small swaddled form of Noah. The baby was stirring, his feverish cries lost in the roar of the wind. Blackwood thrust the bundle into Elijah's arms, the familiar weight a sudden, terrifying anchor. For a single heart-stopping second, Elijah saw a flicker of something in the director's eyes. Not pity, but a look of profound, final contempt. Then, with a grunt of exertion, Blackwood gave them one last violent shove. They tumbled out of the doorway, off the stone step, and into a deep drift of snow. The great oak door slammed shut behind them, the heavy, metallic sound of the deadbolt sliding into place, echoing like a gunshot in the screaming wind, sealing their fate in the heart of the unforgiving night. The desperate plan took root in the space between his brother's shallow, rattling breaths. Elijah lay in the darkness, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from Noah's tiny body, a fever that was consuming him from the inside out. The watery gruel served hours earlier had been refused, dribbling from the corner of the baby's mouth, offering no sustenance. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful in its clarity. His mother, her hands dusted with flour, mashing a piece of warm bread with milk in a small bowl for him when he was sick with a winter chill. The thought was a torment, a vision of a love and care so distant it felt like a dream, but it was also a spark. As Noah let out a weak, whimpering cry that was barely audible above the howling wind, Elijah knew that the risk of staying put had become infinitely greater than the risk of acting. The fear of being caught was a distant, cold star compared to the burning, immediate terror of watching his brother fade away. The decision wasn't made with logic, but with the fierce, primal instinct of a protector pushed to the absolute edge. He had to move. His mind, sharpened by years of constant vigilance, immediately locked onto a target: the kitchen. It was the heart of their suffering and the only place in the entire building that held the promise of real food. He knew its layout from his daily chores: the position of the long wooden tables, the hulking silhouette of the stove, and most importantly, the location of the pantry where Director Blackwood kept the good food under lock and key. But he also knew the director's habits. On nights when the wind was particularly loud, Blackwood would sometimes sit in the kitchen claiming the noise disturbed his sleep. The plan that formed was brutally simple: a single, desperate objective with 1,000 ways to fail. He would slip past the director's quarters, enter the kitchen and find something, anything, that could be softened for Noah to eat. He pictured the route in his mind, a treacherous map drawn in shades of darkness and fear. Each step a calculated gamble against discovery and brutal punishment. The image of Blackwood's face, a mask of cold disdain, rose in his mind, and a tremor of pure fear ran through him. He remembered Thomas, a boy of 14, caught trying to steal a shriveled apple from the director's private stores. He had been locked in the root cellar for 3 days with only water, and when he emerged, something in his eyes had been permanently extinguished. The memory was a physical weight, pressing down on Elijah's chest, making it hard to breathe. The consequences of failure were not abstract, they were a known and terrifying certainty. For a long moment, he was paralyzed by that fear, by the cold logic that told him the risk was too great. But then he felt the weak, fluttering pulse of his brother's breath against his neck. The fear for Noah was a hotter, sharper thing. It burned away his own terror, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. He would rather face the cellar, or worse, than do nothing while his brother died in his arms. His preparations were ones of silence and memory, for he had no physical resources to gather. He possessed only his knowledge of the building's secret language. He knew which floorboard groaned like a dying man just outside the director's door, and how to shift his weight to the edge to avoid it. He knew the iron latch on the kitchen door had a tendency to stick and required a specific upward lift before it would move without a metallic shriek. He ran through the sequence in his mind, an intricate, silent ballet he would have to perform in near total darkness. He pulled his threadbare shirt tighter around his thin frame, not for warmth, but to prevent the loose fabric from snagging on a splintered doorframe or a stray nail. He was a shadow preparing to move through a landscape of sound traps, his only tools the quiet discipline and hyper-awareness that had been beaten into him over 3 long years. He waited, listening to the symphony of the sleeping orphanage. The wind provided a constant, shrieking cover, but it was the internal sounds he monitored. The rhythmic, wet coughing from the far corner of the dormitory, the soft whimpers of a boy caught in a bad dream, the collective, shallow breathing of 40 exhausted children. He needed to wait for the deepest part of the night, what his father had called the 2 o'clock stillness, when the world seemed to hold its breath. He tracked the slow progress of the moon, a sliver of pale, cold light moving across the frosted glass of the high window. Each minute that passed felt like a lifetime, as Noah's feverish heat seemed to intensify against his skin. The mental clock in his head was a relentless, agonizing metronome, ticking down the remaining moments of his brother's strength and pushing him closer to the point of no return. Before he moved, he performed one last silent ritual. He looked around the vast, cold dormitory, his eyes tracing the familiar shapes of the cots in the gloom. This place had been his world, his prison for more than 1,000 days. He felt no attachment to it, no sense of loss, only a profound and bitter resignation. He looked at the pale, sleeping faces of the other boys, each one an island of private misery. They were not his brothers, only fellow survivors. His true farewell was for Noah. He leaned down, his lips close to the baby's ear, and though no sound escaped, he spoke a clear and simple vow. He promised he would not fail. He promised he would bring back something to fight the fever. It was a promise made to the memory of his parents, a desperate prayer whispered into the heart of the storm. In that moment, he severed his ties to the boy who endured and became the boy who acted. The signal to move was a subtle shift in the storm's rhythm. For a brief 10-second interval, the howling of the wind dropped to a low, guttural moan, creating a pocket of relative quiet. It was now or never. He slid from his cot, his bare feet making no sound as they met the shockingly cold stone floor. The chill was a jolt to his system, a final, sharp reminder of the stakes. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed for the journey ahead. He took one last look at the small, feverish bundle he had left wrapped in his own thin blanket, a fragile treasure he was risking everything to protect. Then, turning his back on the only home he had known for 3 years, he took his first step into the darkness, a small, determined ghost moving toward the most dangerous place in his world. He moved with a practiced, weightless grace, a phantom in the oppressive gloom of the main hall. He passed the first row of cots without incident, his feet instinctively finding the paths worn smooth between them. But as he neared the center of the room, his ankle brushed against a loose bed frame. The resulting metallic scrape, though quiet, sounded like a thunderclap in the tense silence. A few feet away, a boy named Daniel, known for being a light sleeper, stirred in his cot, rolling over with a loud, sleepy groan. Elijah froze instantly, flattening himself against the cold stone wall, trying to make himself invisible. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. He waited, not daring to breathe, as Daniel mumbled something incoherent and then settled back into a deep, rhythmic snoring. The danger passed, but it left Elijah trembling, the cold sweat on his brow a testament to how close he had come to failing before he had even begun. The impact of the deadbolt sliding home was a sound more final than a slamming coffin lid. For a single stunned second, Elijah stood motionless, the world reduced to a maelstrom of screaming wind and blinding, swirling white. The cold was an immediate, physical assault, a predator with teeth of ice that bit into his exposed skin, stealing the breath from his lungs. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. He fumbled with the buttons of his own threadbare flannel coat, his fingers already stiff and clumsy, and tore it open. He pushed Noah deep inside, against the thin warmth of his own chest, creating a fragile, inadequate pocket of shelter. The baby let out a weak, muffled cry against his sternum. It was the only sound in the universe that mattered. He pulled the coat tight, wrapped his arms around the precious bundle, and turned his back on the dark, unforgiving silhouette of St. Joseph's Orphanage for the last time. He had no plan, no map, only a single, desperate imperative. Move. To stay still was to die. The orphanage, with its faint promise of shelter, was now as alien and unreachable as the moon. The only direction was away. He lowered his head against the punishing gale and took a step, then another, his worn-out boots sinking deep into the powdery snow. The town of Millbrook was over 2 miles away, a distance that felt as vast as the ocean. Reaching it was not a plan but a prayer, a faint flickering hope in the face of an overwhelming certainty of failure. The wind howled in his ears, a chorus of mockery, trying to push him back, to force him to his knees. But he leaned into it, his small frame a fragile bulwark against the storm's immense, indifferent power, driven only by the need to put distance between his brother and the man who had condemned them. He could not see more than a few feet in front of him, the world erased by a curtain of driving snow. Navigation was impossible by sight. He had to rely on memory, on the lessons his father had whispered to him on long-ago walks through these very hills. His father, a man who understood the logic of the land, had taught him how to read the world with his feet. He had explained how the ground always sloped toward the water, how even a frozen creek left a subtle depression in the earth. Elijah shuffled his feet, feeling for that almost imperceptible dip. After a few agonizing moments of disorientation, he found it, a shallow, winding trough hidden beneath the snow. This was Black Creek. It would lead him toward the town. He began to follow it, a ghost navigating by the ghost of a memory. His father's voice a quiet, steady guide in the heart of the storm. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It was an invasion. It seeped through the thin soles of his boots, turning his feet into blocks of unfeeling wood. It crept up his legs, a slow, relentless numbness that promised a final, peaceful sleep. Each step was a monumental effort, the snow a thick, greedy mire that clung to his ankles and tried to drag him down. He moved in a slow, shuffling rhythm, a desperate, stumbling march against the encroaching frost. The weight of Noah, normally a comfort, now felt immense, an anchor that threatened to pull him under. He hugged the small body tighter, a desperate attempt to share a warmth that he himself was rapidly losing, knowing that every calorie of heat his own body generated was a second longer for his brother. Periodically, he would pause, huddling behind the meager shelter of a snow-laden pine, and pull back the collar of his coat. He needed to see, to be sure. In the swirling whiteness, he would peer into the dark cocoon he had created. He was looking for the one sign of life that mattered, a faint white puff of breath in the frigid air. Each time he saw it, a tiny cloud of vapor that proved Noah was still breathing. A wave of relief so powerful it almost brought him to his knees would wash over him. The baby was terrifyingly still, his feverish warmth a stark contrast to the deathly cold surrounding them. Elijah would adjust the swaddling, using his own body to block the wind, whispering promises that were stolen by the gale as soon as they left his lips, before closing the coat and resuming his agonizing journey. The creek bed, which had been his guide, soon became a trap. The wind had piled the snow deeper into the depression, creating drifts that were sometimes waist-high. His progress slowed to a crawl. He was burning through his limited energy, fighting for every single foot of ground. A new, colder fear began to seep into his mind. He would not make it. The town was too far. The storm was too strong. He made a split-second decision, a desperate gamble born of his father's practical logic. He had to get to higher ground where the wind might have scoured the snow thinner. He veered away from the relative safety of the creek's path, beginning a slow, arduous climb up the side of the low, rolling hills, his lungs burning with the effort, every muscle screaming in protest. Time dissolved into a meaningless concept. There was only the present moment of struggle, the shriek of the wind, the burn of the cold, the dead weight of his own limbs. The world had shrunk to the few feet of churning snow in front of him, and the precious, fragile life held against his chest. He lost all sense of direction, guided only by the upward slope of the ground. He could have been walking in circles for all he knew. He was a solitary, microscopic speck of life in a vast, churning universe of white death, his entire existence focused into a single, repetitive motion. Lift one foot, plant it, then lift the other. It was a purely mechanical act, his mind shutting down everything but the most essential function of survival. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the surface, a fallen log, slick with ice. He pitched forward, twisting his body in mid-air with a desperate, acrobatic lurch to ensure he landed on his back. The impact was a jarring shock that radiated through his spine, knocking the wind from his lungs. He lay there, gasping, the snow melting against the back of his neck, the sky a dizzying vortex of white. For a long, dangerous moment, he did not want to move. The thought of just closing his eyes, of letting the snow cover him like a final, peaceful blanket, was a sweet, seductive poison. It would be so easy to stop, to let the exhaustion claim him. The fight was too hard, the cold too deep. Just as the darkness began to creep into the edges of his vision, a sound from within his coat cut through the storm's roar. It was a weak, whimpering cry, a tiny, miserable protest from Noah. The sound was a jolt of electricity to his soul. It was not a plea, it was a command. He could not stop, he could not fail. He gritted his teeth, the pain a sharp, welcome reminder that he was still alive, and pushed himself up onto his elbows. With a groan that was half pain and half desperation, he struggled back to his feet, his body shaking violently. He readjusted his hold on his brother, his movements clumsy and slow. He had been given his orders. He had to obey. He pushed onward, his steps even more unsteady than before. He was moving through a section of scattered pines when the ground beneath his right foot simply vanished. It wasn't a trip. It was a complete and total collapse. He had stepped onto the edge of a massive hidden snowdrift, and it gave way like rotten floorboards. He plunged downward, a scream catching in his throat as he was swallowed whole by the suffocating white. Panic, pure and absolute, seized him. He was blind, buried alive, the immense weight of the snow pressing in on him from all sides. He couldn't breathe. His arms were pinned, his frantic struggles only seeming to pull him deeper. This is it, he thought, a moment of chilling, final clarity. This is where we die. But the fierce, primal need to save his brother was a force stronger than his own terror. He stopped struggling and forced himself to think. He remembered his father explaining how a trapped miner could find his way out of a cave-in by letting a little saliva dribble from his lips to see which way gravity pulled. He couldn't do that, but the logic held. He needed to find up. He thrashed his head back and forth until he felt a slight loosening of the snow above him. It was a chance. He drove his free hand upward, clawing, digging, fighting against the crushing weight. His lungs were on fire, his vision filled with black spots. Just as he felt his consciousness begin to slip away, his fingers broke through the surface. He gasped, sucking in a lungful of air so cold it felt like swallowing fire, and used that single point of contact to haul himself, inch by agonizing inch, out of the snowy grave. He collapsed onto the surface, a trembling, gasping wreck. He was soaked through, the snow that had packed inside his clothes now melting against his skin, leaching away the last of his body heat. The brief surge of adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that was almost paralytic, shivering so violently that his teeth chattered. He knew, with a dreadful certainty, that he could not go much further. His body was failing. His mind was clouded, his thoughts slow and thick like molasses. He stumbled to his feet one last time, driven by a force that was no longer conscious will, but pure animal instinct. He was a machine running on its last fumes, his only purpose the small, warm weight in his arms. He took another step, then another, his movements robotic and uncoordinated. His right foot, now a completely numb and useless appendage, swung forward. Instead of sinking into the soft powder, it struck something unyieldingly hard. The impact sent a painful, jarring shock all the way up to his hip, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the dull thud of hitting a rock or a frozen log. It was a hollow, resonant metallic clang that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Confused, his mind struggling to process the unfamiliar sensation, he brushed away the snow with a numb, clumsy hand. His fingers met a flat, cold surface. He felt a line, a seam, and then the distinct round shape of a rivet head. It was metal. He was kneeling on the roof of something that had been buried here, lost and forgotten in the heart of the storm. With numb, clumsy fingers, Elijah clawed at the snow, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible object beneath him. The metallic clang had been a sound from another world, a note of solid, man-made reality in the chaotic symphony of the storm. He scraped away more snow, revealing a long, flat surface of dark, painted metal, punctuated by a row of rivet heads that were like frozen steel buttons. It was a roof buried in the Wyoming hills, a silent, forgotten tomb waiting in the blizzard. Hope, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful, surged through him with the force of a physical blow. It was shelter. It had to be. He scrambled along the edge of the exposed surface, his hands raw and bleeding from the cold, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps as he searched for a way in. A seam, a window, anything that would grant him access to the sanctuary that lay hidden beneath his feet. He found it near the end of the exposed section, a rectangular outline, slightly raised with a thick, frozen-over handle. A door. It was set vertically into the side of the buried structure, almost completely encased in a thick shell of ice. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. The door was a solid, frozen block, and he had no tools, only his own failing strength. But the image of Noah, his small body radiating a feverish heat against his chest, burned away the doubt. He used his boot to kick at the ice around the handle, the dull, jarring impacts sending shocks of pain up his leg. He chipped away at it with his bare hands, ignoring the searing cold as he worked with a frantic, desperate energy. He wedged his numb fingers under the iron handle, gritting his teeth, and pulled with every last ounce of strength his 12-year-old body possessed, his muscles screaming in protest against the unyielding metal. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The door remained as fixed and immovable as the frozen earth around it. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, a deep, groaning crack echoed from within the frame. The seal of ice had broken. He pulled again, his entire body trembling with the strain, and the heavy door screeched open just enough for him to squeeze through. He didn't hesitate. He tumbled into the opening, falling from the chaotic, screaming world of the storm into a void of absolute, shocking silence. The wind was gone. The world was utterly still. He landed on a hard, carpeted floor, in a darkness so complete it felt like a physical substance pressing in on his eyes. The air was colder than a tomb, a deep, stagnant cold that had been sealed away for years, yet it was a mercy. It was a cold without teeth, a cold without the relentless driving force of the wind that had been trying to tear him apart. His first thought, as always, was for Noah. He scrambled into a sitting position, his back against the inside of the door he had just forced open, and carefully pulled his brother from the confines of his coat. In the oppressive blackness, he could see nothing. He had to rely on touch and sound. He placed his cheek close to Noah's tiny mouth, waiting, his own heart a frantic, panicked drumbeat in his chest. He felt it, a small, warm puff of air against his skin. Then another. The relief was so profound, so overwhelming, that it left him dizzy and weak. He sagged against the door, the last of his adrenaline draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. He had done it. He had gotten them out of the storm. For the first time in 4 hours, they were not actively dying. As his eyes slowly, painfully adjusted, the absolute blackness softened into a deep, murky grey. Faint, ethereal light filtered down from high windows, which were completely obscured by the deep blanket of snow above. Shapes began to emerge from the gloom, the elegant, curved backs of seats upholstered in what looked like dark velvet, the glint of polished wood along the walls, the ornate pattern of the carpet beneath his hands. He was inside a passenger car, a relic from another time, preserved in the earth like an insect in amber. The air was thick with the faint, dry smell of old fabric and dust, a scent of time itself standing still. There was no sign of decay, only a profound sense of abandonment, of a journey that had been interrupted decades ago and never resumed. It was a ghost ship, buried in a sea of snow, and they were its only passengers. He knew he couldn't stay by the door. The cold from outside was still seeping through the opening. He needed to find a more sheltered spot, a place where he could wrap Noah and himself and try to conserve what little body heat they had left. He stood on unsteady legs, his muscles stiff and protesting, and shuffled deeper into the car. He ran a hand along the back of a seat, the velvet pile surprisingly soft beneath his fingers. His gaze scanned the length of the car, searching for blankets, for anything that might offer a measure of comfort. Tucked beneath one of the seats, almost completely hidden in the shadows, was a dark, solid shape that didn't belong. It wasn't part of the car's built-in luxury. It was a heavy wooden trunk, its surface dark with age, bound with straps of brass that glinted faintly in the dim light. A strange, inexplicable curiosity pulled him toward it. It felt intensely personal, a piece of someone's life left behind. He knelt before it, his numb fingers tracing the grain of the wood. The latches were not locked. With a deep, hesitant breath, he lifted them. They opened with a soft, metallic click that seemed deafening in the profound silence of the car. He paused for a moment, a tremor of apprehension running through him. He felt like a trespasser, an intruder about to look upon secrets that were not his to know. But the need for something, anything, to help them survive was stronger than his hesitation. He gripped the edge of the heavy lid and with a low groan from the old hinges lifted it open, revealing the contents that had been waiting in the darkness for more than 20 years. The first thing he saw was a small girl's dress, neatly folded. It was made of a soft, pale blue fabric, and the collar was embroidered with a delicate chain of white and yellow daisies. The sight of it was a quiet shock, a symbol of a gentle, protected childhood so alien to his own experience, it felt like it was from a fairy tale. Beneath the dress lay a small carved wooden horse, its paint faded, but its form still proud and animated. He reached in and touched its smooth, worn surface, imagining the small hand that had once held it. These were not mere objects, they were artifacts of love, tangible proof of a care and affection he could only dimly remember. They were relics from a lost world, a world where children were given beautiful things, not for their utility, but simply because they were loved. Tucked beneath the folds of the dress was a single piece of paper, yellowed with age and folded into a neat square. He picked it up, his hands trembling slightly, and carefully unfolded it. The light was poor, but he could just make out the elegant looping cursive written in a faded brown ink. He held it closer, his eyes straining to decipher the words. "For our beloved daughter, Clara," he read, his own voice a rough, unused whisper in the silent car. "On your 10th birthday, may this wagon take you on magical adventures. With all our love, Papa and Mama, 1867. The simple, powerful words struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a message in a bottle, a testament to a love so vast and unconditional that it had survived for 2 decades, buried and forgotten under the earth. He read the letter again and then a third time, the words blurring through the sudden hot tears that filled his eyes. He didn't cry from relief. He didn't cry from the cold or the exhaustion. He wept for the profound, aching loss that the letter had suddenly unearthed within him. He hugged Noah tighter against his chest, the small, warm weight of his brother a fragile anchor in the sudden, overwhelming sea of his grief. He wept for the father whose practical lessons had just saved his life, but whose face he could barely remember. He wept for the mother whose gentle hands he could no longer feel. He wept for Clara, the little girl who never got to have her 10th birthday. In the cold, silent heart of the buried train car, surrounded by the ghosts of a lost family's love, Elijah Samuel Crawford cried for a world he had lost and for a home he might never find again. His tears were not a storm, but a quiet, steady thaw, the breaking of an ice dam that had been forming inside him for 3 long years. The letter to Clara was a key, unlocking a grief so profound it felt bottomless. He was weeping for a love he had never known, for parents whose faces were becoming hazy watercolor paintings in his memory. He held Noah, the only solid living piece of his past, and felt the immense, crushing weight of his own solitude. In that buried railcar, surrounded by the silent testament to another family's affection, he was an island, a forgotten survivor of a shipwreck no one had witnessed. The cold air was thick with the ghosts of laughter and whispered bedtime stories, a world so far from the iron-fisted cruelty of St. Joseph's that it felt like a myth. He was mourning not just his own family, but the very idea of family itself. As the first wave of sorrow subsided, a new feeling began to surface, a deep, resonant curiosity. The trunk was not just a container of grief, it was a story. He carefully placed the letter aside and reached back inside, his fingers brushing against something hard and rectangular, tucked beneath the folded dress. It was a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with time. There was no lock. With a trembling hand, he opened it to the first page. The same elegant, looping script as the letter filled the page, but this writing was more hurried, more practical. Robert Anderson, engineer, a log of our Western Passage, April 1867. He felt a jolt of recognition, a strange kinship across the decades. His own father had been a man of logic and mechanics, a man who understood the world through gears and pressure. This was a language Elijah understood. He began to read, his whispered voice filling the silent car, giving life to words that had been asleep for 22 years. Robert Anderson wrote of his dream to build a new life in the West, away from the crowded cities. He described his wife, Mary, and her love for wildflowers, and his daughter, Clara, a girl with a boundless imagination who saw adventure in every shadow and cloud. The journal was filled with the mundane details of their journey, but to Elijah it was a chronicle of impossible happiness. Anderson wrote about designing this very Pullman car, reinforcing its structure and adding special insulation, intending it not just as transport, but as their first home, a rolling sanctuary built with his own 2 hands, a fortress of love for the 2 people who were his entire world. The entries were interspersed with detailed, intricate drawings. There were diagrams of a small, highly efficient wood-burning stove designed to maximize heat output with minimal fuel. There were sketches for a ventilation system that could circulate air without losing warmth. He saw plans for collecting and melting snow for water, and notes on how to use dark, painted stones to absorb and radiate the sun's heat. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He traced the delicate ink lines with his finger, the logic of the designs instantly familiar. These were the very principles his own father had explained to him on cold winter nights, lessons about thermodynamics and pressure, the secret language of how the world worked. It was as if his father's ghost was standing over his shoulder, nodding in approval. He turned the pages with a growing sense of urgency, the story of the Anderson family pulling him deeper. He read of their excitement as they crossed into Wyoming territory, of Clara's delight at seeing the vast, open plains. Then, the tone of the journal began to shift. An early, unseasonable blizzard had descended upon them, forcing the train to a halt. Robert wrote of his confidence in the car he had built, his certainty that they could wait out the storm in safety and comfort. He described the howling wind outside, a sound Elijah knew all too well, but from a position of warmth and security that seemed an impossible luxury. They were not afraid. They were together, a small, warm island of humanity in the heart of the wilderness, protected by the ingenuity born of a father's love. The next entry was written in a scrawled, frantic hand, the elegant script shattered by panic. The sound was like the world breaking. Robert described a deep, rumbling groan, a sudden, violent lurch, and then an absolute suffocating darkness. A landslide. The mountain had come down upon them, burying their car in an instant, snapping it from the rest of the train and entombing them in the earth. He wrote of their initial desperate attempts to break a window, only to find themselves sealed in by a wall of rock and frozen soil. The air grew thin, the hope began to fade, but his love for his family burned brighter, a desperate, defiant flame against the encroaching dark. He was no longer an engineer writing a log. He was a husband and a father writing a eulogy. The final entry was just a few sentences, the handwriting weak and unsteady, trailing off at the end. The air is almost gone. Mary and Clara are asleep in my arms. I have failed them. If, by some miracle of God, these words are ever found, know that we did not die in despair. We died as we lived, together. Clara, my darling girl, your 10th birthday would have been a magical adventure, I promise. The journal slipped from Elijah's numb fingers. He was no longer weeping for his own loss. He was weeping for Robert, for Mary, for Clara. He was not an intruder who had stumbled upon their tomb. He was a witness. He had been sent here, he felt with a sudden, chilling certainty, to hear their story, to ensure that their final, desperate message was not lost to the silence. He sat in the profound stillness, the weight of their story settling over him. He was not alone in this metal shell. The Andersons were here with him, their love a tangible presence in the cold air. He looked at the diagrams in the journal, the elegant solutions to the problems of survival. He looked at the letter promising a magical adventure. He looked at the small, feverish body of his brother, still breathing, still fighting. A new feeling, fierce and powerful, began to displace the grief. It was not hope, not yet. It was purpose. He was not just a victim of Horace Blackwood's cruelty. He was Elijah Samuel Crawford, the son of a machinist, and he was Robert Anderson's inheritor. He would not just survive in this tomb. He would use the knowledge left behind to turn it into a sanctuary. He understood now that he hadn't found a grave. He had found a blueprint. The love that Robert Anderson had poured into this car, the meticulous planning and engineering designed to protect his family, had not been in vain. Its purpose had simply been delayed. It was waiting for him. It was waiting for Noah. He picked up the journal again, his movements now deliberate and steady. He turned back to the diagrams of the stove, the ventilation system, the heat-absorbing stones. He began to study them, not as a historical curiosity, but as an instruction manual. The fear and exhaustion that had plagued him for hours began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear focus. He had work to do. He made a silent promise, a vow spoken not with his voice but with the sudden, unshakable resolve in his heart. He spoke to the ghosts of the Anderson family, to the memory of his own father, and to the fragile, sleeping infant in his arms. He would not let this place be an ending. He would honor the love that had built it and the knowledge that had been preserved within it. He would take the legacy of two fathers, one his by blood, one his by fate, and he would forge it into a future. The blizzard still raged outside, a monster of wind and ice, but for the first time, Elijah felt no fear. He had found a weapon against the cold, a shield against the world's cruelty. He had found the last will and testament of a father's love, and he would make sure it was executed. Over the next 2 weeks, the buried Pullman car was transformed. Driven by the twin engines of his father's lessons and Robert Anderson's journal, Elijah worked with a tireless, focused intensity. He ventured out into the storm only when necessary, a small, determined figure scavenging from the town dump on the edge of Millbrook. He returned with treasures, discarded sheets of tin, broken panes of glass and old empty food cans. Inside the car, which he began to call the Clara, he constructed a small, remarkably efficient stove from the tin cans, its design a near-perfect replica of the one in Anderson's journal. He used mud and strips of velvet from the seats to seal the cracks, and soon a small but steady warmth pushed back the tomb-like chill, a defiant heart of heat beating beneath the snow. He chipped away the ice from one of the high windows, creating a crude skylight with the broken glass he had found. He then lined the floor beneath it with dark stones he had painstakingly gathered, painting them black with a mixture of soot and melted snow, just as the journal had instructed. During the day, the weak winter sun would filter through the glass, and the stones would drink in the light, slowly releasing its warmth through the long, cold nights. He created a small, subterranean microclimate, a secret pocket of impossible spring buried in the heart of a deadly winter. He planted the few dried beans and shriveled carrot tops he had found in his pockets, nurturing them in the rich soil he dug from a corner of the car, watering them with melted snow. Life found a new rhythm. During the day, he worked on his hidden world, and at night he would read to Noah from Robert Anderson's journal, his voice soft in the warm, flickering light of the stove. The baby, nourished by a thin but warm broth made from scavenged potato peelings, began to recover. The fever broke, and a healthy color returned to his cheeks. For the first time in his short, miserable life, Noah was consistently warm and fed. He began to thrive in their subterranean sanctuary, his gurgles and coos filling the silence that had held sway for over 2 decades. Elijah watched him, a fierce, protective love swelling in his chest. He had not just saved his brother. He was giving him a childhood, even if it was in a place the world had forgotten. In early March, a shadow fell over Millbrook. Scarlet fever, a swift and merciless killer, swept through the town. A strict quarantine was imposed, cutting off all supplies. Food became scarce, then non-existent. The town's physician, a determined woman named Dr. Josephine Hartwell, watched helplessly as her patients, especially the children, grew weaker, their bodies lacking the strength to fight the disease. Desperate for any source of fresh food, she followed a faint, almost invisible trail of footprints leading from the town dump into the hills. The tracks led her to a mound of snow with a strange glinting patch on top, from which a thin wisp of smoke curled into the grey sky. There she discovered the impossible, a 12-year-old boy and a healthy infant living in a buried train car surrounded by rows of vibrant green lettuce, spinach and carrots. The discovery sent a shockwave through the starving town. The vegetables from the Clara were harvested and distributed by Dr. Hartwell, a miraculous bounty from the frozen earth. The fresh, nutrient-rich food was credited with the recovery of 43 patients, strengthening their bodies and allowing them to overcome the fever. Among the saved were 12 children from St. Joseph's Orphanage. The story of Elijah's survival and the subsequent investigation unraveled the entirety of Horace Blackwood's monstrous operation. It was discovered that over 8 years he had sold 115 boys to the railroad gangs. The town's gratitude turned to righteous fury. Blackwood was arrested, tried, and met his end at the gallows, his reign of terror finally over. Elijah and Noah did not return to the orphanage. They were adopted by Jonathan and Rebecca Whitfield, the town pharmacist and his wife, a kind, childless couple who had lost their own son years before. For the first time, Elijah knew the feeling of a warm bed, of full meals, of a life without constant fear. With the Whitfields' help, he established the Crawford Foundation, using funds donated by a grateful town to ensure no child would ever suffer as he had. 5 years later, a 17-year-old Elijah Crawford, no longer a boy but a young man with his father's steady eyes and Robert Anderson's quiet ingenuity, stands on a windswept hill in Montana. He oversees the construction of another subterranean greenhouse, this one built into the side of an orphanage, turning the legacy of 2 families, one lost to the earth and one lost to greed, into a harvest of hope that would feed hundreds.